So, Chapter 15 of Boruto's Two Blue Vortex is out, and a lot happened. However, so far as it comes to crafting theories from this chapter, there isn't a huge amount to talk about. See, because Chapter 15 heavily focuses on answering existing questions that had popped up in the beginning stages of Two Blue Vortex. And therefore, because this chapter seemed more focused on answering questions than prosing new ones, when it boils down to trying to theorize about what the future of Boruto looks like, genuinely, I don't have a huge amount to talk about. See, because Boruto, for the first time in at least Two Blue Vortex, is hit what I refer to as a plot dead point. But dead point might be too leading of a word. Really, what we've reached is a point in the manga where literally anything can happen. Chapter 16 could show Kawaki and Boruto training together to take down Amado, could show the Hidden Mist's response to Shinju invading other villages like the Hidden Sand, see Sarada and Himawari having a conversation as Sarada tries to sway Himawari over to Team Boruto, or so much more. Really, this chapter leads us with no leads in any real direction, outside of one thing and one thing only, that Kawaki and Amado got some talking to do. See, because the biggest and most important reveal in Chapter 15 was when Boruto revealed to Kawaki that Kawaki is purposely being nerfed. And by who else but Amado. And this was huge news because this runs contrary to basically everything we knew about Amado and Kawaki's relationship. I mean, the very reason that Kawaki is even remotely as powerful as he is right now is because Amado placed a karma marking on him pre-time skip. And without that karma marking, Kawaki would be next to nothing in the grand power scale of this universe. And yet in Chapter 15, it was revealed by Boruto that Kawaki, much like Code, has had limiters placed on his strength, defensive ability, and regeneration. Limiters that Boruto tells Kawaki that eventually he gets raised, but he's trying to expedite that process, presumably using information given to him by Kashin Koji's usage of the 10 paths. But with this reveal that Amado's been purposely keeping Kawaki weak, we as the readers can't help but raise a couple of eyebrows, as the explanation that's given to us in Chapter 15 as to why Kawaki would purposely be kept weak by Amado is because Amado doesn't want Kawaki to die. But that doesn't make sense because the stronger Kawaki is, the less likely he is to die. And thus, something's not clicking. And so today, I want to dive into the meat of this problem, because there's no way I'm accepting the simple explanation of Amado's keeping Kawaki weak so that Kawaki stays alive. And thus today, I have three possible explanations as to why Amado would do this to Kawaki, placing the limiters on him, that is. And these three answers differ from each other pretty massively, both in rationale and context. And thus, with no further ado, let's get into Amado is Boruto's final villain. But before we get to diving into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're feeling particularly generous and want to hear me talk about anime and manga that aren't Naruto and Boruto, go ahead and follow my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime and manga. Or if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, Amado is keeping Kawaki weak. And so far as we care, or willing to care, it's not to keep him alive. See, Amado has always been a shady figure in Boruto, especially in Two Blue Vortex, and is even shadier now that we've realized that not only has he been suppressing Kawaki's power, but he also has a camera in one of Kawaki's eyes. And that's kind of like Nagato with all of his passive pain, Amado is able to see through the eyes of all of his cyborgs, presumably. But based off everything we know about Amado, at least what Amado wants us to know about Amado, there should be no real reason for him to want any of his cyborgs to be weak, especially those who currently align themselves with Amado, like Kawaki. See, because while it does technically make sense that Amado would want cyborgs like Code weak, as Code is a maniacal sociopath who's trying to live up to the ideologies of the now gone Ishiki, and thus is in a sense keeping Ishiki alive through his own motivations, it makes sense that Amado would be reticent of the idea of trying to strip those limiters away from Code, when you consider the fact that the entire reason that Amado joined Kara in the first place was to make sure Ishiki didn't take over the world. And since Code is Ishiki 2.0, Amado and Code are on opposing sides. But if Amado's sole motivation in joining Kara was to make sure that Ishiki doesn't take over the world, why would he make Kawaki, the person who has the most logical beef with Ishiki, weaker? And now some of you are going to say,
oh, but Nick, Kawaki didn't get the second karma marking until Ishiki was dead.
And you're right, he didn't. However, remember what I literally just said about Code being Ishiki 2.0, the logical continuation of Ishiki's wants and desires? That means that Amado still has an enemy out there, and it's Code, who's trying to destroy the entire world. And once again, Kawaki is in a very precarious situation of being the person directly versus Code, as Code needs to feed either Kawaki or Boruto to a Ten-Tails to create the Divine Tree to harvest a chakra fruit and essentially bring Ishiki back to life. So once again, if Amado truly doesn't want the world to end at the hands of Ishiki or Ishiki 2.0, why would he make Kawaki weaker? Specifically, why would he make Kawaki weaker than Code? And yeah, Kawaki is weaker than Code by like a lot. And this has actually been established in alternate timelines, because we've seen alternate timelines from Kashin Koji's 10 Paths view where Kawaki is taken out by Code and fed to the Ten-Tails and a divine tree is grown. And thus Amado's motivations here of keeping Kawaki weak to keep him alive make no sense. So what are our three possible explanations? Well, right out the gate, we can't blame it on Jigen like we could with Code. Obviously, the reason that Code had limiters placed on him by Amado was because Jigen identified if Code didn't have limiters, he'd probably be stronger than Jigen. And while Code was incredibly subservient to Jigen, if Code realized he was stronger than Jigen, he may not have been. But Jigen and Ishiki were already eliminated by the time that Amado placed this new karma marking on Kawaki. And it's not like Code was telling Amado to put limiters on Kawaki because Kawaki without limiters might be stronger than Code, because Amado at this point was already under the sanctuary of Konoha. And at the same time, it definitely wasn't anybody within Konoha, because one, Amado didn't really consult with anybody, and two, even if he did, there's no way Naruto would tell Amado to nerf Kawaki. Naruto, the literal embodiment of probably too much trust, would want Kawaki, his son, to be as powerful as possible. So the first real explanation that I can think of that makes some sense logically, but also really doesn't if you dive into the meat of the story in the context of what we're talking about here, is that Amado purposely put limiters on Kawaki to make him non-intimidating. What do I mean by this? Well, think of a character like Genma, a Jonin in Konoha who served hundreds of missions and survived some of the deadliest battles of all time. Now, why does a character like Genma survive until the end of the story when characters like Madara or Kaki don't? Well, because if you're powerful enough to get yourself out of a fight and take a couple of blows, but not powerful enough to be identified as a real, legitimate threat, then nobody's gonna go out of their way to take you out. And this might be the logic that Amado is applying to Kawaki. And quite honestly, the logic is kind of worked up until this point. See, Kawaki has found himself in battles against incredibly powerful foe, and yet they never seem to try and finish him off. In the beginning of Two Blue Vortex, when Kawaki finds himself in battle against Hidari and Jura simultaneously, he's defeated so soundly that Jura and Hidari essentially write him off as a threat. Something that they don't do to the likes of both Himawari, Boruto, and maybe even Sarada. See, because here's the thing. The fact that Boruto, Himawari, and Sarada were able to injure the Shinju in any way whatsoever makes them a legitimate threat against the health of the Shinju. However, because Kawaki's attacks were so easily dodged and he was so easily dispatched of by the likes of Jura, after he was kicked into a giant water tank, they were just like, well, you know, if he comes back, we'll deal with him again. Which is drastically different from what happens with Boruto, because when Boruto is knocked unconscious at the end of his battle against Jura, Jura goes to line up a shot that would effectively end Boruto's life. And if it wasn't for the intrusion of the bug Shinju, well then Boruto would have died right then and there. And thus, in a sense, Amado keeping Kawaki strong enough to not die when a Shinju punches him, but not strong enough to be intimidating to a Shinju, is a pretty good way to keep him alive. However, if we go through with this line of logic, how did Amado choose how powerful to make Kawaki, right? Because Boruto seems to say that the limiters were placed very purposely to keep Kawaki at a certain level of power. If Amado did willingly keep Kawaki at a certain level of power that wouldn't make him intimidating to the Shinju, how would he know what level to make that? That would seem to imply that either Amado knew that the Shinju were coming and somehow knew exactly how powerful they were, or that Amado picked a certain level arbitrarily that seemed to equal roughly around the power level of Boruto pre-time skip. Now, that's not a crazy concept, make him as powerful as Boruto. Yeah, I guess. But it still feels kind of arbitrary, doesn't it? Like there's no real reason to any of it, which is why I buy more into the second explanation, which is that Amado is keeping Kawaki weak, specifically so that when and if Kawaki needs to be overtaken by Amado, he can be. And the interesting thing about this explanation is that both the first explanation and this explanation are bolstered by the presence of Delta. But what do I mean by that? See, as we all know, Delta is supposed to be a genetic cloning of Akebi, Amado's daughter. However, even though Amado is able to exactly genetically replicate what Akebi looked like, he's unable to grasp at what her personality is. And every single time he makes a new generation of Delta, he gets further and further away. Now, the generation of Delta we have right now was built after the previous generation of Delta died in a fight against Naruto. And when this generation of Delta was introduced, she was introduced as a powerful ally for Konoha. And while she is absolutely that, at least on the surface level, rather interestingly, Delta appears to be everywhere Kawaki is. Whether it's flying into combat or just hanging out, Delta is always around Kawaki. And considering the fact that the previous generation of Delta, which is undoubtedly weaker than the newest generation of Delta, was able to go toe-to-toe with the likes of KCM2 adult Naruto, this newest version of Delta is no joke. And I believe, rather purposely, we haven't seen her fight yet. See, there's been a lot of situations in which Delta could have been involved in some form of combat. Most notably is when Kawaki flew off to battle against Shura and Hidari simultaneously. However, in this fight, Delta simply kind of observes Kawaki as he gets his teeth kicked in by the two of them. And then when Kawaki gets kicked halfway across the village into a water tank, Delta, instead of engaging against Shura or Hidari, goes to his aid. And thus, while there's been plenty of opportunity for Delta to be involved in a high-level battle, we haven't seen just how powerful she is yet. And I believe that that may be intentional. And the intentionality of that plays both into the first explanation and this second one. See, the intentionality of that plays into the first explanation in the way that you could say that Delta was assigned to protect Kawaki. That Kawaki is being kept at a certain level of power, so he's not intimidating, but Delta, who's more powerful than him, is assigned to Kawaki to keep him alive. Which is strangely poetic when you consider the fact that Delta is a genetic copy of Akebi, and she's being assigned to Kawaki so that Akebi can be brought back to life. On top of that, the intentionality of this moment plays into the second explanation, because you can make the argument that the reason that we haven't seen Delta fight yet is because Kawaki isn't supposed to know that Delta is stronger than him. See, Amado's plan has never necessarily sat right with me. See, the way that Amado pitched his karma plan to Kawaki is that Kawaki would essentially be getting an empty black karma that contained the abilities and battle experience of Ishiki, but not his soul. However, Amado would be implanting the soul of Akebi into his karma marking. So if Kawaki's ever in the situation where he's beaten down Code, he'll be able to place that karma marking on Code, and when that karma marking fully manifests into Code, Akebi will reawaken. But based off what we know now, that plan doesn't make any sense. See, because for that plan to be effective, Kawaki would need to be stronger than Code. And yes, the entire plan is for Kawaki to place a karma marking on Code. That was the plan with Boruto, to get rid of Momoshiki until Kawaki kills Boruto, and Momoshiki has to sacrifice something like the last 14% of the karma marking's extraction to save Boruto's life. And now it's Amado's plan to bring Akebi back to life, to use somebody compatible with the karma in Code who doesn't already have a soul attached to them, because Code's karma marking is white, to bring Akebi back. But once again, I reiterate that this plan doesn't make sense because Amado is purposely keeping Kawaki weaker than Code. On top of that, even without that wrinkle, this plan doesn't make a huge amount of sense. See, let's talk for a second about what we know about karma markings. You can have infinite karma markings out in the universe, so long as you can find enough people to be compatible with your karma marking. However, the second that you use one of your karma markings to manifest, all other karma markings disappear. While we're talking about the Akebi karma marking like it's an empty karma marking that just so happens to have Akebi's DNA and soul inside of it, essentially what's being stated here is that Kawaki has Akebi's karma marking. So wouldn't it make a somewhat fair amount of sense that if Kawaki was to place his karma marking on somebody like Code, and Akebi were to take over Code's body, eventually remanifesting and reincarnating, that Kawaki's karma marking would once again disappear? And while yes, there's an argument to be made that only the chakra and DNA of Akebi would disappear from his karma marking, kind of like how Amado pitched it, what Amado pitched runs counter against what we now realize are his true intentions. And so what if the real reason that Amado is purposely keeping Kawaki weak is because one day whenever Code is captured, presumably by the combination of Kawaki and Delta, that it's revealed to Kawaki that once he places his karma marking on Code, once it fully manifests on Code and Akebi is reborn, Kawaki will no longer have a karma marking. And Amado, who's now achieved his life's work of bringing Akebi back to life, will have no real reason to give him another one. And thus Kawaki will need to be forced to place his karma marking on Code by presumably the likes of Delta, who will be stronger than him because of the presence of the limiters on Kawaki. But what if neither of these explanations are true? What if the real answer is so far beyond the pale we haven't even begun to formulate what it possibly could be? Well, that's what an email that was sent to me recently tried to establish. Because I got an email from somebody by the name of Jason recently, and this was my favorite kind of email to receive, that contained an incredibly detailed theory that not only used in-universe logic, but also out of universe logic. And thus right now, I want to talk to you about our third and final possible explanation as to why Amado would purposely keep Kawaki weak. And while this theory is the most fun, it's probably the least sensical. Because Jason's not a professional, and He rambles sometimes. So I'll give you the cliff notes. See, this entire theory hinges on the idea that Shibai is not the main antagonist of Boruto's 2 Blue Vortex. And everything that we've learned about Shibai is in actuality a red herring to throw us off the scent of the real main antagonist, Amado. See, because while it's been theorized for a long time that somehow, someway, Amado is tied to Shibai, and while many fan theories have gone so far as to say that Shibai's long-lost secondary Otsutsuki was in fact Amado, this theory takes those theories one step further, saying that not only was Amado Shibai's lower-ranking Otsutsuki, but Amado was, in essence, the original Kaguya, because it was revealed to us relatively early on in Boruto that when Kaguya and Ishiki descended down to Earth, Kaguya betrayed Ishiki, ripping him in half and taking the chakra fruit that he was about to eat for herself. This theory stipulates that us learning that was actually foreshadowing for the exact same thing happening with Amado and Shibai. Kind of. See, what this theory is trying to build at is that a dispute over the final chakra fruit, the one that was created by Earth, caused Shibai and Amado to split, both physically and philosophically. And I have to admit, this theory is pretty interesting. See, because here's the thing. One of the biggest through lines throughout Boruto is perception, and how perception becomes reality. The best way that this is shown to us is the firing of omnipotence from Ada, the moment in which everybody in the Boruto universe had their idea of Kaki and Boruto swapped. And how regardless of what you tried to show these people or tell these people, they would genuinely believe that Boruto was Kawaki and Kawaki was Boruto, showing us that their perception has become their reality. But in a way, that rule applies to us as well as readers. What we're told throughout the duration of this manga becomes the reality of how we perceive this manga. And everything we've been told about Shibai is that he's some big, bad, final boss god, an entity of such supreme power that he was able to create storms with the waving of a hand, and was able to wield all of the Shinjutsu in existence. An entity of such supreme power that he was able to consume enough chakra fruits to ascend beyond physical form. But if Shibai is well and truly such a being of pure evil, where is he? I mean, he's never done anything bad to planet Earth, so why are we so worried about him? And when you start to ask those questions, you realize that everything we've ever learned about Shibai was told to us by Amado. And thus, in a sense, by listening to Amado as readers, Amado has shaped our perception of Shibai, creating the reality of how we talk about him. And while Momoshiki does confirm everything that Amado was saying inside of Boruto's head to Boruto, in actuality, all that Momoshiki confirms is that Shibai is, yes, an Otsutsuki, and that Amado is telling the truth about Shinjutsu. But Momoshiki doesn't confirm anything about Shibai outside of the fact that Shibai was, yes, an Otsutsuki. And in actuality, the only reason that Momoshiki confirms that Amado isn't lying about the Shinjutsu is so that Momoshiki can tell Boruto that he doesn't believe that Ada's charm ability is a Shinjutsu he's ever heard of. And thus, when it really boils down to it, everything we've ever learned about Shibai has been warped through the perception of Amado, the guy we've all been suspicious of from the moment he was introduced in this manga. See, because nothing makes sense about Amado. His story about how he tried to clone Akebi back to life, but when she awoke, he realized that it wasn't his daughter, and in that very moment Jigen stumbled upon him, the one person that Amado would need to replicate Akebi's soul into somebody else just happened to appear to him the second he realized his cloning technique failed. And thus Jason goes on to acknowledge the fact that he's not the first person to be suspicious of Amado, touching on the fan theory that Amado is Shibai's lower-ranking Otsutsuki. Jason goes on to say that a lot of these fan theories end up with the idea that Amado is somehow, someway, trying to bring Shibai back to life, and how that doesn't make that much sense. See, because if we are to believe what we've been told by Amado and what has been confirmed by Momoshiki, that Shibai was able to consume enough chakra fruits that he was able to ascend out of his physical body into a different dimension, Momoshiki confirms that Shibai's not in this dimension. He doesn't necessarily confirm the ascension, but still. Then why would either Shibai want to come back to life or Amado want to bring him back to life in the first place? I mean, the ascension to an Otsutsuki god is surely something that Shibai wanted to do. And since the goal of every Otsutsuki is to accomplish this transformation, why would Amado, who's supposedly the lower ranking Otsutsuki of Shibai, want to strip that goal and accomplishment away from Shibai? And thus, technically, the more logical answer here is that Shibai and Amado weren't friends at the end. Rather, that they've become enemies. And it's this point that Jason begins to back up his theory with outside explanations, touching on the fact that Kishimoto, and probably therefore by extension Ikemoto, like to write their stories with a heavy amount of Hindu or Buddhist influence. And thus Jason goes on to explain, and quite aptly I might add, that the story of Shibai and Amado may closely resemble that of Mara and Prince Siddhartha, also known as the first Buddha. I mean, not known as the first, just known as Buddha. But there's like He was the first to do it. Now, this to me is where this theory gets spicy. Jason doesn't do a perfect job of connecting all of the possible wires to each other to make this outside connection as interesting as possible, so it's from here on out I'm going to take some creative liberties with this theory. See, the story of Mara and Prince Siddhartha is a story of temptation and trying to overcome it. Mara is an Asura, which is essentially a demon in Buddhism, but Mara isn't just a regular Asura. He's a malignant celestial king Asura, one of the most important and powerful devils in all of Buddhism. Now, Mara's most important role, because Mara does have several tails and multiple different variations actually in Buddhism, is that after Prince Siddhartha achieves enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, Mara appears in front of Prince Siddhartha, who's trying to become Buddha, and begins to tempt Buddha so that Buddha doesn't undergo enlightenment. Now, rather interestingly, the Bodhi tree plays an incredibly important role in Buddhism. But what is the Bodhi tree? Well, the Bodhi tree in the Buddhist religion is the tree that Buddha prayed under for 2 weeks in order to achieve enlightenment. But the Bodhi tree is just a kind of tree. Well, there is the Maha Bodhi tree at Sri Mahabodhi Temple in Bodh Gaya in India, which is supposedly the tree that Buddha prayed under to achieve enlightenment. The Bodhi tree is a kind of tree that can be found all across India and adjoining countries. And rather interestingly, the Bodhi tree is a fig tree. Yes, that's right. The tree that Buddha achieved enlightenment under was a fruiting tree, and thus the Bodhi tree is known as the sacred fig tree. And while that could be a coincidence, the fact that the Bodhi tree is known to lead to enlightenment and produces fruits seems oddly similar to that of the divine tree. And thus this confrontation between Mara and Prince Siddhartha, who's trying to become Buddha, happens at the base of the Bodhi tree. But how does Mara try to tempt Prince Siddhartha out of achieving enlightenment? Well, Mara generates images of beautiful women, and in most tellings of this story, these images of beautiful women are in actuality Mara's daughters, and thus essentially Mara tries to tempt Prince Siddhartha into not achieving enlightenment by showing him lustful images of his daughters. And rather interestingly, because in the scenario Amado is Mara, Amado's entire reason for implanting a karma marking in Kaki in the first place, being his daughter, is rather interesting and something that we'll circle back to in a second. However, when Buddha doesn't bite on the images of women that represent earthly desires, Mara instead creates an army of demons that are supposed to instill fear in Buddha. And ironically, an army of demons is kind of exactly what Amado has achieved with Kara, as Ada, Daemon, Code, and Kawaki are all immensely powerful borderline Otsutskis. However, and this is where the connection gets real interesting, Buddha sees through all of these manipulation tactics by Mara. And he's able to see through all these manipulation tactics like lust and fear using what is known as Buddha's eye, which is also often referred to as Buddha's pure eye. And thus, because he's able to see through all the manipulation tactics of Mara, he's able to ascend, achieving the Buddhadom that Mara specifically did not want him to be able to achieve. So what if in actuality Shibai's ascension went something like this? What if Shibai, upon consuming the final chakra fruit and awaking the Jogon, the pure eye, realized that all of his earthly desires to gain as much power as possible didn't mean anything, and that upon the awakening of this pure eye, Shibai decided that rather than continuing on pillaging planet after planet to try and acquire as much power as possible, rather Shibai would ascend into godhood, where he could exist possibly as some kind of pacifistic god. But Amado, the lower ranking Otsutsuki in this equation, doesn't want that to happen, and for good reason maybe, because all these newfound beliefs that Shibai would be espousing upon the awakening of his pure eye would run directly counter to everything that Amado would know and hold dear as an Otsutsuki. And maybe prior to his ascension, Amado, in a very similar situation to Ishiki, after being consumed by a Ten Tails for what would be ostensibly the last time, reincarnated in a karmic vessel that he wasn't 100% compatible with, leaving Amado in a heavily weakened yet still immortal state, a state that would not want to be without Shibai. And thus, what if Amado's entire motivation is to either bring Shibai back to Earth to exact revenge, or to bring Shibai back to Earth because Shibai is his only ticket off the planet? And thus the reason that Amado is purposely keeping Kawaki as weak as he currently is because Amado knows that if Kawaki ever finds out that he's trying to use Kawaki to bring the god of Otsutskis to planet Earth, that Kawaki would A, not be willing to be used for that plot, and B, would probably kill Amado on the spot. In actuality, that might be the most sound explanation. Amado is keeping Kawaki weak because Amado fears that Kawaki will find out Amado's backstory, and in that circumstance, Amado goes to the top of Kawaki's shit list. But what does Akebi have to do with all of this? Well, Akebi may serve as the catalyst, or possibly the final temptation that brings Shibai back down to planet Earth, allowing for Amado to achieve what Mara could not: the stripping of enlightenment from a god. And while this theory might sound insane, my god, do I love taking any opportunity to teach you guys something about history through one of these silly old videos. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. Out of these 3 explanations, which do you believe is the best explanation as to why Amado is keeping Kawaki weak? Or do you believe it's a separate explanation that we didn't talk about in this video? Tell me in the comments below. And while I go down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. If I'm going to achieve one thing with this page, it's teaching all of you science and history.